Thank you, everybody. Our speaker today, I've known for quite a while, is Bill Engelbrecht. Now, his wife is here as well. He's going to introduce her in a little bit. Bill grew up here, right here in central Illinois. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois with a master's degree. Spent 26 years in Chicago at the world-famous Leo Burnett Company. Ended his career there as executive vice president in charge of constructing their 1 million square feet corporate headquarters on Wacker Drive. Later named U of I Outstanding Alumnus, Bill ran for public office and was elected a constitutional officer of the state of Illinois and later chairman of the board of trustees of the University of Illinois. He resettled back here in Peoria and spent 10 years as vice president of Bradley University. Now retired, he volunteers in District 150 schools, dabbles in local politics, and is now a recognized author as well. Bill is also a veteran. His wife Helen is with him today, and they're going to share the podium. And I think he's most famous for his son that went to Richwoods and played basketball, who I liked very, very much. And we got along so well. He was a great kid. Please give Bill a warm Rotary North welcome.
You didn't mention that I've been a Rotarian at 2 different organizations. I want to introduce my wife, Helen, who played a big role in writing this book. Helen has a sort of unique background. Helen was born in Germany, and her parents were prisoners of the Germans during that time, and she made her way over here through Ellis Island, of all places, and came through here and distinguished herself with a degree from Marquette University. And she is a thespian. Careful how you watch that word. And she's never seen a play that she didn't want to be a part of. So you can see her in all kinds of, and she joins me in this. As I mentioned, I'm presenting a book. I'm going to read a book. So it'll take about 3 hours. Actually, it's a unique kind of a thing, and we're going to end with a book signing. And this is going to surprise you today. This is a story that's never been told. It was June 10th, 1940. And the hero of this biography was sitting in his office at 14 Place Vendôme in the city of Paris. At the age of 57, he was president of the J.P. Morgan Bank in Paris. It was the largest American bank in France. His office was the famous Place Vendôme, one of the most historic, celebrated squares in all of Paris. But it had been the home of affluent emperors. It was the site of parades, the site of weddings, and the site of beheadings. The immense bronze obelisk outside the front door was made of melted down cannons taken by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz. This was the day, June 10th, that the German Gestapo, guns drawn, burst into his office. The American Banker in Paris is the name of the book. It's a remarkable but untold true story of a guy by the name of Nelson Dean Jay. It's an opus-sized adventure of a man who influenced world events in Europe and America. Today, as you know, most books, movies, Netflix, all those kinds of things are fiction. This is a biography. It's something that happened to a real person, a real individual. And a good biography is one that illuminates and shows the times as much as the person. This one shares the defining moments of growing up right here in central Illinois. Events that molded Dean Jay. He became successful. He became wealthy. He became famous. But not here. He became famous in Paris. I like to be surprised by the character in a book. I like to be surprised all the time. Being surprised is one of life's great little pleasures. This biography will surprise you. As you will learn, during the Roaring 20s in Paris, the dean was a friend of Ernest Hemingway. He lived around the corner from Coco Chanel. He used to go and visit with Gertrude Stein in her bookstore. He had some adversaries, of course. One of them was Helmar Horace Greeley Schott, happened to be Hitler's banker. Jay was described in the New York Times review of Hemingway's book, A Movable Feast, as one of the most civilized, authentic Americans in Paris. Wait a minute. The kid from Central Illinois that was named one of the most authentic Americans in all of Paris, and you've never heard of him. He was a member of the welcoming party for Charles Lindbergh when he made his first nonstop transatlantic flight, alone, New York to Paris. He helped provide the money for the work of his friend, Nobel Prize winner Madame Marie Curie, that laid the foundation for modern oncology. And you may wonder, was Dean Jay a spy to do all these things? Probably not, but you can decipher that yourself. Everyone sought his advice when they went to Europe, from presidents to popes to dictators. He was an informant in a good kind of way for people who needed information. In this book, we share with you the romance. Yes, there's romance in this book. Tragedy, a lot of it. Humor, and his ascendancy, along with some deep disappointment. Things that can only be said about this person. So how did it all come about? Well, if you remember, you older folks in here remember a TV program back in the 60s called The Naked City. They had a little line that said, there's 8 million stories out there, and this is just one of them. This guy has been walking around all of his life waiting to be discovered. A lot of the work here comes from the intimate writings of both Dean and his wife Anne. Real facts, all stitched together and now etched in posterity. Stuff even his kids didn't know. I have all of his letters, his photos, his guest book, his diary, his bank accounts, even his will. Personal interviews over the past many years from his grandson George, who now lives in California, Daniel, who lives in St. Louis, Paul, who lives in New York, his granddaughter Susan from Las Vegas, and Wendell, who lives in Florida, and one granddaughter who lives out as part of the Hole in the Wall gang in Montana. He has another granddaughter who really was an FBI spy in Ohio. Finally, there's the matriarch of the family, daughter-in-law Cynthia, who is now 94, and when I call her up, she'll still give me one more little secret about Nelson Dean Jay. The librarians at the J.P. Morgan in New York, Yale University, Harvard University, Northwestern University, Bradley University, and who mentioned earlier, Knox College, were great resources. Last but not least, we have family keepsakes, awards, even the invitation from President Charles de Gaulle to the splashy event that welcomed President and Jackie Kennedy to France. In a way, it's sort of eerie as you listen in on the intimate parts of this man's life. Now I'd like to introduce my wife, Helen. Helen, we've been married for quite a long time, got married in a great big cathedral in Chicago, and I can remember this pretty little girl walking down this aisle in this great big cathedral, and I could hear all the whispers. What in hell did she see in him?
That was his side of the family.
So we'll start with a little romance. From a blind date in 1908, a little snippet of how Dean met his wife Anne, out of chapter 4. Helen?
Thrilled by his blue eyes and magnetic smile, she said, "You must be Dean. And you must be Anne Augustine," whispered the tall young man. "Your roommate was accurate when she said you'd be the most beautiful woman on the floor." The orchestra began with 2 slow numbers popular in the day and appropriate for a budding romance. "If You Cared for Me" and "When It's Moonlight on the Prairie." The couple sat down at a table for 2 while the orchestra began to change pace with Scott Joplin's Fig Leaf Rag. Dean and Anne could have kept up the pace, but they wanted to learn more about each other. For the next 2 hours, they didn't hear a note until the last dance ended with Ardo Habach's "Cuddle Up a Little Closer." The young man held Anne tightly in his arms and whispered, I'm going to marry you. Over the next year, their romance blossomed, and Anne broke her engagement to another man, much to the disappointment of her parents. In 1910, Anne Augustine of St. Louis, Missouri, and Nelson Dean Jay of Elmwood, Illinois, were married on the lawn of her parents' home before more than 400 guests, many who had arrived by special train from the city. The honeymoon lasted for over 2 months in the Wisconsin Lake Country, and the marriage lasted for over 60 years.
Sort of like Helen and me. You know, as I discovered this man, I would find myself drifting aside, delving into little sidebars. One of them was, if you just heard, she gave up a romance with somebody to marry Nelson Dean Jay. So I said, who was that? It was a member of the Koch brothers family. She really could have been somebody. Historical biographies are a popular category. Not as popular as romance novels, but popular. Writing about a person's life means living with them intimately. Often I would struggle to understand him. He had a certain vulnerability to him. Somewhere in the book, he decided to confess of the things that embarrassed him most in life. How many of us are willing to say that and have it published? You will find him somewhat endearing. Sure, he could annoy me, but just as often he would delight me with his business acumen, his whimsy, and his humanity. A biography has to have a theme. This was a small town kid who worked harder than all of his other friends. He really did sell pots and pans door to door. He married what he thought was the prettiest girl in town. He paid his own way through college. He helped win World War I. Wait a minute. This guy helped win World War I? He's one of the most decorated men that you will ever hear about in your life. He was decorated by Austria. He was decorated by Belgium. He was decorated by France. And he was decorated by the United States. 4 countries decorated this man. Who did he report to? A guy by the name of Blackjack Pershing, famous. Who reported to Pershing? General Patton, General MacArthur, Field Marshal George Marshall, and Eisenhower, and so Nelson Dean Jay. There is no hero worship in this book. It's just the facts about this guy. In this biography, we share with you the milieu of the times. It was amazing how much I learned when I drifted to the side and found all of these interesting things. But first, it was so unlikely that a kid from central Illinois, Dean Jay, would become a part of the world's richest, most influential bank, that J.P. Morgan would personally seek him out to offer him the position as president of the bank in Paris, his bank in Paris. And a J.P. Morgan bank was pretty unique. They had no teller cages. They had no consumer loans. They granted no mortgages. They serviced governments, large corporations, rich individuals. They catered to, when you came into their office, there was a rich leather armchair in that corner and a grandfather clock over there, polished brass lamps, a private dining room. They would actually take your menu, engrave it, and give it to you before you left from lunch. The waiters all wore white gloves. In 1920, race was not an important issue. So were blacks in the world of banking. But the J.P. Morgan folks fit a very strict profile. They were white, they were male, they were Republican, they were Episcopalians, they were Anglophiles, and a very strict Ivy League education. Harvard was preferred, and an Eastern Seabourn antecedents were suggested. Not true for Nelson Dean Jay. He came from just down the road here. Jews were definitely forbidden. Catholics often even found it harder than Jews to enter high finance. It was quite the opposite for Nelson Dean Jay. A small Midwestern town did not attend an Ivy League school. He was Presbyterian, and most likely he was a Democrat. One of the publishers that I screened this book with out east before I published it described it as an opus-sized adventure. Well, I wasn't smart enough. I had to go look up what the word opus meant. But you might enjoy one of his favorite stories that he passed on through his grandson and then to me. It was about the entrepreneur Andre Citroën. If you haven't heard of Andre Citroën, he made automobiles at one time. A few of them actually landed around here. So this is 1918 when they first met in World War I. And now he was back in Nelson Dean Jay's office in his Paris bank office in 1923, 5 years later. Quote, "Remember I told you in 1918 that I wanted to become the Henry Ford of France?" said the young man sitting in Dean Jay's office. "Now here I am 5 years later. I want you to drive my prototype automobile." "I'm sorry, I don't know anything about cars, but I would like to see yours," said Jay. The two men continued to talk while Jay sat behind the wheel and honked the horn of Citroën's 5-horsepower car, about the size of your lawnmower. But if you're looking for money to build cars, I can't be too encouraging, because J.P. Morgan feels that automobiles may just be a fad. He's more interested in investing in railroads. But I have a couple of friends across the street who know a little about cars and might be interested in your project. Jay and his friend walked across the street to the Hotel de Rouen, where Jay introduced the three gentlemen, Alfred and Walter. "I want you to meet my friend who's just developed a new automobile prototype." The Frenchman's eyes lit up when he heard the friend's name. It was Alfred Sloan, the president of General Motors, and Walter Chrysler, the head of the Buick division. Days later, Andre Citroën, Jay's friend from World War I, received an envelope from the J.P. Morgan and Nelson Dean Jay containing a check for millions of dollars to build the first factory outside of Paris. In a few short years, the French car maker was living his dream. His was the most popular car in all of France, stimulated by a kid from Central Illinois. I mentioned earlier that Jay was a good friend of Nobel Prize recipient Madame Marie Curie, possibly the world's greatest female scientist ever. I have 12 pieces of correspondence between Madame Curie and Nelson Dean Jay. To me, they are like little pieces of gold, this correspondence. She was Polish and she spoke French. Helen,
Yes.
am I correct that you're also Polish?
Tak, to jest prawda.
Would you be kind enough and come up here and read one of the pieces of correspondence between Nelson Dean Jay and Madame Marie Curie?
Sure. Dobry wieczór, panie i panowie. Madame Curie była dobra przyjacielka pana Albert Einstein.
They don't speak Polish.
You said to read.
I know, but
her.
you have to read it in English, honey.
She Polish.
No, English, please, out of the book.
Okay. I don't think she'd like that, but I'll do it anyway. All right. Madame Marie Curie was a friend of Albert Einstein. She won 2 Nobel Prizes, discovered polonium and radium, which eventually led to the discovery of radioactivity and the X-ray machine. But very few of us know that Nelson Dean Jay played a small but very important part in her life as well. During World War I, Curie eventually became the director of the Red Cross Radiology Service. She converted hundreds of cars into mobile radiological units known as Little Curies, containing portable X-ray machines to pinpoint the location of shell fragments and bullets in wounded soldiers. Her work is credited with saving the lives of thousands of soldiers. For her efforts, President Hoover presented Curie with a $50,000 gift on one of her trips to the United States. In November 1929, a colleague of Nelson Dean Jay wrote to him and said that Madame Marie Curie would be coming back from America to Paris with her $50,000 gift to purchase 1 gram of radium for her research. He asked Jay to handle the transaction and invest any leftover funds that she may have had for future needs. With the money and Jay's financial guidance, Curie would go on to establish the Radium Institute in Paris and Warsaw, which laid the foundation of modern oncology. Jay and Curie were hardly equals in their accomplishments, but they still had much in common, both having come from humble beginnings and having spent years of giving of themselves to save lives as volunteers for the Red Cross. Dziękuję bardzo.
I just can't take the Polish out of that girl. A good biography will often enjoy some unexpected characters or personalities. This one is sort of close to home, right here in Peoria. I'll explain in a minute. It was Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy. He was a constant friend of Nelson Dean Jay for 40 years. Jay was there when Lindbergh, in 1927, was the first to fly New York to Paris alone, nonstop. At that point, Lindbergh was the most famous person in the entire world. What I learned was that J.P. Morgan had funded most of the flight of the Spirit of St. Louis to Paris. Somebody's nodding their head. They knew that. In Nelson Dean Jay's flight jacket, or in Lindbergh's flight jacket pocket, was a business card of the person he was to meet when he landed. Whose name was on it? Nelson Dean Jay. They were friends for more than 40 years. It was sort of a rocky road. It went up and down because Lindbergh had done some questionable things during his life. But toward the end of the book, you'll read a personal letter from Anne Lindbergh to Anne Jay upon the death of Nelson Dean Jay. It's really a heart stopper, a great relationship between the two. And the reason I mentioned that was sort of personal for me, of course, I learn something every day. I live on Helen and I live here right here on High Point. And during the pandemic, we would, like many of you, we were out walking and stuff like that, and we would walk down High Point. And there's a flag halfway down High Point. There's a great big rock there. I thought, I've been by this a million times. What on earth is the rock, and what is the flag for? So we crept up to it to see what it was, and it's a rock. It's an insignia for where Lindbergh landed when he would fly the mail from St. Louis to Chicago and Chicago back to St. Louis. And he would land and drop off the mail right here on the highest point in Peoria, which was High Point. So the man sort of was down the road from me. Not everything works out in life to the best. Many things did for Nelson Dean Jay. Sort of like the story of Larry Laprise. You remember Larry Laprise? Of course, Larry died here recently. He was 93. Of course, Larry, as you know, was the author of the Hokey Pokey. But most traumatic of all for his family was when you tried to get Larry into the casket. They'd first put his left leg in and then his right arm in, and that's when all the trouble started. I'm waiting for the rest of you to catch on. The reason I bring this up, this is not a book about finance. It's a book about an individual, and very interesting. And one of the things he did do that was related to finance was between the wars, they had to reconcile the issue of reparations. The Germans had caused all the trouble. The French wanted some money in return. America had spent all of its money, so who was going to pay who for what? And the argument went on from all over Europe and all over the United States. Who was the individual that represented the United States for 14 years in the middle of the arguments about reparations and who was to pay? It was Nelson Dean Jay, and you can read about that. During the 30s, a lot of trouble was going on in Paris. A lot of it had to do with what was going on in Italy. At the time, Nelson Dean Jay had worked and helped finance the Italian government. He had helped finance the Italian banks, Fiat Motors. He even helped manage the books and consulted with the Vatican. But during that time, Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia and using poison gas had killed many Ethiopians. One of those things that not a lot of us are aware of. But at that time, Nelson Dean Jay was very aware of it because he was helping fund the Italian government, and he cut off all of all the funding from the banks, the American banks, to the Italian government and through Mussolini. And that brings me to Mademoiselle Quinard. Wasn't it Jimmy Buffett who sang, "Some people claim there's a woman to blame"? Before I get in trouble, I'm going to let Helen talk about Mademoiselle Quinard.
I get all the good stuff.
Juicy.
Yes. One of the constants in Dean's life was Mademoiselle Quinard during and after World War II in Paris. She was crucial in her role as both secretary and assistant. She knew Jay's entire family. Dean traveled and entertained a lot. Anne was often in America with her sons and her own family, and Dean was in Paris. He also did not want Anne to be caught up with the dangers of the German buildup and the occupation. In Anne's letters to Dean, she would often ask when she could return. He would just as often turn her down. Mademoiselle Quinard took instructions from Anne on family matters and from Dean on business. In 1945, just as the war ended, she was entrusted with burning family correspondence upon Anne's instructions. She had already burned some of Anne's old correspondence. Later, she found letters from both Dean and Anne, but did not have the courage to destroy them, as Anne had asked, but she just put them away for safekeeping.
So I had to chase that down. I asked all the grandsons what was going on. I asked all the granddaughters what was going on, and you'll have to decide whether something was going on. You know, during the war, there's a chapter called Mrs. Wadsworth Lingerie, and it's not what you think. During the war, when the Germans came in, who was there? When they marched down the Champs-Élysées, who was there? Was Churchill there? No, he was hid away in Britain. Was de Gaulle? No, he was tucked away in Spain. Where was Marshal Pétain? He was in the south of France. Who would you have gotten the true story from? It wouldn't have been from those guys. They were out of Dodge. But there was somebody who was there, who wrote to his wife every day about the Germans and their occupation on the very early days when they marched in 1940. Let me grab one little paragraph out of a letter, which he, by the way, they wrote back and forth ferociously. This is to his wife, Anne, because she had snuck out, or he had asked her to leave Germany or France because the Germans had come in. Quote, "The horrible thing is that it's true that the Germans fired directly on the refugees. As you know, I am determined to believe nothing unless someone whose eyes I can trust tells me that he himself has seen it. Many, many men have. They are horrified. They can talk of nothing else, even their own experiences, and you can imagine what they have been, seem nothing besides the refugee suffering and the horror of having seen them bombed and machine gunned. The Germans must be mad. Everyone says they are doped." Another quirky kind of things that you couldn't imagine would happen to anybody else was, again, when Dean was still in Paris, the Americans were not at war at that exact moment, so he had some freedoms. He still had to run his bank. He had to deal with the Nazi occupation as well. So in all of these dealings during these years, he would sit across the table from all kinds of folks who were in Paris. And there was one Nazi full-blooded colonel who sat across the table from him, whose last name was J. It was his first cousin. What an interesting story. This story actually evolved over time into a movie called Is Paris Burning, which you may or may not have heard about in the 60s, and a book called Is Paris Burning? And of course, the cousin Jay wound up in prison, as you might have expected. And lastly, let me do something, and Helen is going to do something that maybe you've never had done to you before. We're going to ask you. Yes, Helen, you want to take it from there? What are they?
I'll take it from there.
I'd like you to maybe just close your eyes for a minute as Helen is going to describe Nelson and Ann J. We'll wake you up, won't steal your purse.
Ann's niece, Mary Augustine, was an accomplished, observant OSS officer and spy. Listen as she spoke approvingly about the Jays. They were people of substance and seriousness of purpose. You knew they were people to be heard and heeded. Both stood very erect with an unassuming, easy dignity of bearing. They were well above the average height and would have been described as tall. Both had what we might then have called fine figures, with reasonably broad shoulders and trim waists. Add for her a full bust. He had sandy hair and keen blue eyes that genuinely smiled at you, but at the same time were capable of probing deeply. Her eyes had the warmth of Dean, but not the obvious congeniality. Hers conveyed gentleness, seriousness, with a latent low-key twinkle, always ready to move when appropriate into the foreground. Both had low-pitched voices, but he had a hearty, almost booming laugh. Hers was more restrained, ladylike, if you will. Mary went on to conclude that both exuded a feeling of confidence and strength.